very big thank you to everyone's here today braving the Saturday traffic to get to this side of town. And thank you for coming here today to celebrate with us. My name is Deepika. I'm an archivist here at the archives at NCBS. And we are a public collecting center for the history of science in India. We collect material related to all STEM fields from across the country. And these are some of the things that we do. We collect and preserve archival material. We engage in outreach, in education and in research. And this is something that we try to remind ourselves. The launch of any new collection is often just the beginning of the collection. An archive is in a perpetual state of incompleteness. It's not exhaustive. An archive isn't neutral. Its nuance comes from having diverse sources. Archives come from stories. Archives are launching pads for stories. And archives are stronger when they speak to each other and to the world. And right now, all of you here in the auditorium with us are our world. Here are some photos which are a flashback to when the archives launched in 2019. They're from Jan and Feb. You can see the lettering when you come on. If you join us later on a tour of the archives, you'll see the lettering on the door outside. But here you can see the lettering being applied. You can see all of the people, and it's great to see some of the same faces here with us today. But here in the amphitheatre, you see all the people who are at the launch. This is the origin story of the archives. We may have opened in 2019, but the seeds for it were sown as early as the beginning of the 2000s. And Satyajit Nair, Indra Chowdhury, Aparna Uppaluri had a major role to play in the incubating of it. A very big thank you, since today is a day for thank yous, to also our funders, NCBS, TNQ and Arcadia. An equally big thank you to our many donors. Right now they number over 100. Without your trust in us, without your support, we wouldn't be here. Thanks is also due to friends and well-wishers of the archives, to the many people who give us leads and suggestions and contacts and call in favors and transport material for us, sometimes across continents, and provide us with support and friendship and energy and sometimes food. Thank you for being around. Thanks always to Jeetu, Shashi and Uma for their support, and to members of the internal and external archives review committees. Thanks to the many, many people who have worked here. And if it hasn't been clear so far, archiving is the work of many hands. And these photos represent just some of the people who have worked in the archives here over the last year. I should mention that sadly, the Athena, the Alsatian in the center, is not a member of our team. And these are all of the people who have worked at the archives and worked with us since 2017. And as you can see here from the panel on the left, it's a wide range of backgrounds beyond archiving. A very big thank you to all of the teams and departments at NCBS that make our work possible. And I'm going to read them out. The academic team, accounts and purchasing, architecture and civil, the archives review committee, communications team, the dean's office, the director's office, the electrical team, establishment, hospitality and housekeeping, HVAC, instrumentation and IT, the lab kitchen and lab services, management board, the meetings office, the reception, the security team and stores. Thank you very much for being beside us these 5 years. And thank you to all of the institutions that have collaborated with us over the years. And here you'll see a range of libraries, museums and archives, and even a paper factory among them. Thank you to all of them. And here's an overview of some of the things we've achieved in the last year. Well, up to now rather, in the last 5 years, we have 250,000 archival objects that span over 140 years of history. We have over 30 collections in multiple languages, and the oldest material that we have dates to 1876. It's a book of accounts by Mahendra Lal Sarkar about the formation of the IACS, the Indian Association for the Cultivation of Research, and it's one research in science, and it's the oldest institute in India for fundamental sciences. And you see here all of the collections that we've processed in 2023. It's got a long list and it's over 18 collections. 18 collections of physical material, and we have something like 45 sessions of oral history sessions that were processed as well, and many more that are still in the process of being made available to researchers and to the public. Here's where you can go if you need more information about how to access material, about our policy for online access, about our takedown policy, and our preservation and conservation standards. And here's how to navigate our website to get to the material that you want. So this is our homepage. And if you hover over the tab on the top that says collections, you will see a little drop down tab that says featured collections. And once you click on that page, you reach a page. When you scroll to the bottom, you see everything we've processed in the last year. And just as an example, I'm going to show you the first one. I'm going to show you something from the Madhavarao collection. It's the very first one over there. So once you click on Madhavarao, it takes you to this page, which is the collection page, and you see a menu on the right over there that says collection organization. That's a kind of map, that's your key to the entire collection. And supposing we want to look at, for example, a letter, that we'd find it under the series correspondence. So once you click on correspondence, you get a drop down menu that has further subcategories. And just for example's sake, we'll pick the very first one. The very first letter is from 1919 from a person called M.T. Naranayangar. And you see this little icon over there that says go to file. If you click on go to file, it will take you to the actual document. And if there are multiple pages to the same document, you'll see them on the menu on the side. So that's how you can actually view the digital material through our website. And a similar process applies to oral histories. So if we look at a collection, for example, we pick just, for today, for example's sake, we picked a collection called The History of Science. And we picked an interview of someone called V. Shantaram. So if you if you click on Shantaram, you'll see, you click on the session on the right hand side, and that gives you this icon that says go to file. And when you click on go to file, you reach here where you can actually hit play and listen to the recording itself. And that brings me to all of the oral histories that we've processed this year. Since 2019, we have done a whole bunch of oral history interviews, numbering with something like 60 people, over 200 sessions of recordings. And some of these are life history interviews with men and women from a range of backgrounds, including theoretical physics, meteorology, nuclear physics and environmental law. And a number of interviews from 2023, last year, were related to ecology and conservation. And we have a rich collection of memories from wildlife biologists, from journalists, from members of community organizations and others, and a whole lot of material on birds and ornithology, and you'll see this in our physical collections as well. We also had a very exciting collaboration with Nandita Jairaj from the Life of Science, and that brought us 6 exciting interviews with women scientists from a range of disciplines. At the moment, we have processed 45 sessions, and typically processing means summarizing the interview with timestamps. We check the recordings and mute them when necessary for sensitivity. We create keywords and metadata, and we make them available for access. And we have about 150 more from last year that will be processed over the course of this year. And I'll hand over to my colleague Anjali, who will show you some of the exciting new material that we've processed, the physical material that we've processed in the last year.
Thank you, Deepika. My name is Anjali. I work as an archivist at Archives at NCBS. Today I have the very unenviable task of taking you through 100,000 objects in under 10 minutes. At the beginning of the year, 2023, our task was to collect, preserve and make available material related to the history of ecology and conservation in India. And through these 13 incredible collections, we've managed to document a spectrum of practices and cultures of ecology and conservation in India. Most of this material is exactly what you expect it to be, from academics, ecologists, wildlife biologists and conservationists. They have beautiful field notes, there are letters, there are photographs, and there's research data. But the focus of ecology has enabled us to capture the intersections between science and society. Through the papers of WPSS and the Narmada movement, we have managed to document environmental histories of people as well. Pertinent questions of civil rights, developmental issues, environmental conservation will be examined by researchers by using these collections, we hope. There's also material related to government policy, government data, reports and law. There's also art in the form of wildlife illustrations. There's also writings and photographs. There's like this extraordinary photograph of Billy Arjun Singh cradling a baby gharial. We've also managed to collect material that reveal the role of civil society and citizen science and local communities in creating and propagating knowledge and awareness about the environment. We also have personal material like this ornithologist's grocery list. Also a personal stamp collection from wildlife biologists. But this is our largest data set. As you can see, we are under an ever-increasing threat of becoming a bird archive. This year has been a year of firsts for us. We have our first collection from a nuclear engineer. We have a collection from our first mathematician. We have a material from K.S. Critton, who's the co-discoverer of the Raman scattering effect. We also have material from a paleoseismologist couple. We have material related to the history of hematology in India. We have material from a cytogeneticist from bark. We have also material documenting popular science movements in India. What you do when you come to our archive, you can browse through a list of recipes. You can browse through a list of scientific, popular science magazines, writings from ornithologists and bird watchers, and go through an extraordinary number of material in different languages as well. This is perhaps my favorite object from this year's collection. It is P.S. Madhavrau's driving license from 1940, and it has very valuable advice about navigating Bangalore traffic. My favorite one is avoid congested centers as far as possible. If you've crossed Hebbal, you know this is quite difficult in practice. 2024, our mission is to collect material from underrepresented groups in science. If you know of or have material that fits the bill, please contact us at this email ID. I also have the pleasure today of introducing Janaki Nair, who is a historian. She's taught at the Center for Historical Studies, JNU, until her retirement in 2020. Her published works include Mysore Modern, Rethinking the Region under Princely Rule, and The Promise of the Metropolis, Bangalore's 20th Century. Janaki, it's over to you.
No, no.
Mic.
Sure. But the so what time is?
Can you hear me? Can you all hear me? Thank you. Usually, you know, these introductions are so long and you wait for them to end. But today's was unusually and it was a welcome, brief kind of introduction, except one of the most important things about my connection with NCBS has been left out. So let me just say that. I've had a long association with NCBS. And I stand here on this platform after maybe something like 23 years, because it was in the year 2000 that we began this exchange between social scientists and scientists at NCBS. Professor Vijay Raghavan, who was then the director, was kind enough to give us the space to organize that series of lectures, and we have never looked back. I would like therefore to take a little credit for the fact that there is an archives of this kind in this campus, and that it has done a marvelous job of putting together so many archival objects. I feel like an archival object myself today, partly because of the history that I'm relating to you. But first let me begin by thanking NCBS and especially Venkat for inviting me to this event and for giving me a chance to reflect on my own career as a historian and also my acquaintance with the archives. So I'll start with a little joke because, you know, I must be one of the longest standing members who visits the Karnataka State Archives, which for those of you who don't know is located in the basement of the Vidhan Sauda. And when you go there, and especially as your hair starts graying, they ask you without fail, "Nim PhD no aglilva?" So for them research is only that which leads to your PhD. And you know, you have no business returning to an archive once you have completed your PhD. So I hope today I'll say a few things that look back on things that I have had a chance to reflect on as a teacher, but also as a researcher. So it's a combination of both, and I'll try not to take more time than has been allotted to me, because I know there are many historic firsts that are going to happen today as well. So when we were discussing the title and Venkat said Archives for All, the question at the back of my mind was, is it archives for all, or are we talking about history of all? And I say this with deliberate intent, because let's start with, at the very beginning. The word archive itself refers to the imperative of the state for recording its actions. And therefore it is an expression of state power and state authority. The word archive contains that very, it's encoded into that very term. And as the history of archiving will tell us, it is national governments, and especially in the modern era, that established the first national archives. We have our own history, which begins with the colonial period. I will not go into that history, except to say that the colonial authorities produced a voluminous archive. Voluminous, and in some ways, it is still the go-to archive for many questions that we want to answer about our Indian past. I am a modern historian, so for me the archive is extremely important, because it lays bare a large number of things in which I have been interested, ranging from the history of labor to the history of law to the history of women, and most recently the history of peasant rebellion. But let me just give you a little bit of an idea of how historians think about archives before I proceed. And here I'm citing the work of somebody called Carolyn Steedman. Some of you may know her name, who describes and critiques actually a book by Jacques Derrida called Archive Fever. And of course that book was really not about archives at all, but she takes off from that term to talk about the archives and the fever that accompanies the person who is a historian, as a desire to find or locate or possess that moment of origin as the beginning of things. Somehow we all enter the archives with that hope. But of course, as we all discover, sooner or later, and as we learn as historians, nothing ever begins or starts in the archives. By definition, it's something that is, many things may end up there, and we've seen some of the objects that have ended up in archives, but nothing really begins in an archives. In fact, the archives, if you like, is an interrupted story. It is something that we make sense of as historians through the act of interpretation. I'm going to come back to that in a little while. I'm poised over this computer, so I might press the wrong buttons. Okay. I think don't worry too much about it. In fact, yeah. Do you mind if I shut it?
Huh?
Can I shut it?
No.
Okay, so I started by saying that by definition the archive is a record of the state's activities, and it has therefore become, and what we've seen here is something very different, right? So clearly we have moved a good distance away from the idea of just the state being the producer of historical records. There has been a critique of the state record itself, and I'll also come to that in just a minute. But there has been a searching for other kinds of sources, particularly, and here I want to emphasize this point, by those peoples without history, those whose lives have not produced the kinds of documents that you will find in an archives such as the one at NCBS. Who are these peoples without history, and what might their pasts be like if they have not produced an archival record? So many historians, for example, have worked, like myself, have worked on the history of laborers who don't necessarily keep the kinds of records that you would like them to, or peasants. We are, as you know, a largely oral culture. Women do not necessarily have a representation in the archives on the same scale as men. And so what does one do? One goes beyond, obviously, the official archive to look for sources in the belief that archival silence does not mean historical absence. So we take that as a kind of founding point. For example, what were women doing when men were out hunting? It's a question to which perhaps we may not easily find answers on the walls of Bhimbetka, but we need to ask these questions. And the kinds of sources to which we turn, so it's not as if we don't turn to official sources in order to answer some of these questions. We do turn to official sources. For me, one of the richest archives has been the archives of the law, because it is in answering questions that people who have participated, for example, in critical events, such as the food riot, such as a strike, such as a communal riot, such as a revolution, such as participating collectively in murder, and so on, who are interrogated, that they provide this excellent social history of their lives, their ordinary lives, but they are always answering questions that are put to them. So I hope you understand the structure of that interchange itself is an interesting one, because it actually allows the poor and the marginalized a space to speak, but they are speaking in response to the questions of the magistrate, the law, the state, whatever it is. They're responding to questions. And so it is a very staccato voice. It's not a continuous narration of their lives that we get. It's a staccato voice. And of course, it is in eliciting these responses that we get to hear at all about these figures. Having said that, let me say that of late, and especially since the late 1980s, the question of the everyday has begun to interest historians in ways that has allowed them to look for materials and sources that can allow them to construct a picture of everyday life. And there has been, therefore, a proliferation of sources that people have examined in order to conduct, in order to be able to produce this picture of the everyday. The people who have most engaged in this kind of theory of the everyday are really the Germans. It's called Alltagsgeschichte, which literally means the history of everyday life, or the history of the everyday, for which no material is superfluous. No ephemeral material is superfluous. So, for example, they would use postcards, of course, photographs and diaries, but also, and we saw a nice example of this here, menu cards, which would speak both of dearth and of plenty. Cartoons, of course, are a very important and rich source of information about our political life. And this, in some ways, has had an important and interesting effect of actually undermining a certain kind of structural understanding of history. So whereas many of us, especially when we begin as historians, we are looking at big structures, we are looking at big economic structures, we are looking at big political structures. This kind of, the focus on the everyday allows us to actually take attention away from those structures, to some extent even undermine perhaps the nature of those structures, and to be able to tell us things which are quite startlingly insightful. And I'll just give you two examples of this, what the study of the everyday has allowed people to understand. One of these is actually taken from this German historian Alf Leutker, who has looked at the working class and its actions on the shop floor in the Nazi period, in order to make the argument that, first of all, of course, the Nazis were not only supported, as you know, directly and vociferously, but they were also supported through other actions which are everyday actions. So one of the questions he was asking was, what was the working class doing when it had such a glorious history of resistance under the trade union movement and so on in Germany during the Nazi period? And he found interesting kinds of ways of thinking about the everyday. On the one hand, he found a set of actions which allowed them to survive these extremely difficult years. So there were years in which they actually participated, if you like, in the Nazi movement, but not overtly, not through marching with slogans on the streets and so on and so forth, but in their everyday life, in the participation through production itself. And of course, the coded kind of anti-Semitism that was true even of the working class. So much so, he comes up with a startling kind of conclusion, which is that there is no such thing as only a villain. There are also people who are victims. People who are victims, in other words, can also be villains. Now, I say this because this is a very important insight also of the work that especially feminist scholars have done, but other scholars have done too, on the Indian partition. By looking at various kinds of new materials, and particularly by relying on oral history, these historians have established that it is difficult, especially for an event, a massive event like partition, to make the distinction between villains and victims. In many instances, victims were villains. In many instances, villains were also victims. And this kind of insight is, as I say, is not enabled necessarily by a state archive. It is enabled precisely by the kinds of documents and materials and oral histories, immaterial kinds of archives that allow you to speculate and to construct an alternative picture. I also want to say that there are things which cannot answer, and there are things which we as historians would like to answer, but don't necessarily find material evidence to support our inquiries. And I see it as a sign of a good teacher if you've had this phone call from a student in the archive saying, "Ma'am, I have this question, but I can't find a single record to support what I'm looking for." It's routine. We all have our frustrations in the archives. But I do want to refer to one archive which we all profitably have engaged with, and that is the missionary archive. The missionary archive is as rich and dense as the colonial state archive. It also allows us, because it has a very rich collection of, for example, photographs, it allows us to speculate on certain kinds of things. So one of the things I've recently written about, is actually the classroom. The classroom in Mysore between the years 1870 and say 1940 or so, as a sensorium. What is the new forms of tactility that are emerging within this classroom? Because as you know, the colonial classroom is an entirely new kind of space. What does it do for people of different castes to be sitting next to each other, women and men to be sitting next to each other, to be in the same space? What were the kinds of exclusions and inclusions that happen as a consequence of this kind of exchange? And perhaps you don't know this, but the missionaries were among those who set up schools in a state like Mysore before the state actually got involved in establishing schools. So the missionaries have the privilege of having actually established schools, and particularly schools for people of lower castes, long before the state got into the act. So in some ways, missionary archive is an extremely rich source for answering a new set of questions. And it allows you to ask these questions, to be able to ask this question, what is the tactility of the classroom? What is the classroom as a sensorium? I'm just giving you one example of something new that I have actually been able to write about. But there are many such immaterial sources, and I turn to some of this. So there are some groups in our country, because it is a largely oral culture, who rely entirely on certain kinds of immaterial sources for talking or thinking about their past. For example, song. And song has now been, of course, recognized as one of the most important sources for, the performance of the Montesami poem, for example, the epic poem, is one of the ways in which we can get to Dalit histories. Proverbs as a source of the ways in which you think about hierarchy, critique, social exclusion, inclusion, and so on. And of course, myth as a source for history. And we have seen here that NCBS has actually been able to exploit to its advantage the realm of memory in bringing together a large number of oral histories. But in some cases, these oral histories will be in addition to other material sources. I'm talking about oral histories as sometimes being perhaps the only entry into the lives of some extremely marginalized groups who may not have these kinds of written records at all. And of course, we have the question of performance as well, as giving us insights into the kinds of ways of thinking about not just social structures, but gender relations, caste relations, beauty, of course, notions of beauty, and so on and so forth. But I want to come to one very important, as Ranajit Guha, one of the most important Indian historians who has recently passed away, put it, religion. Religion as one of the oldest archives of the subcontinent. That's how he begins this wonderful article which talks about the career of an anti-god. I might add, he has said it is the oldest archive, but I will add also there's one of the richest archives and hasn't been sufficiently exploited as an archival source. And I'm including here, when we talk about religion, practices, but also, certain kinds of chants, stories, of course, associated with religion. And let me just explain to you what he did, for example, in that article which began with that sensational statement. He analyzed various versions of the Rahu myth, the myth that actually Rahu is actually swallowing the sun or the moon during an eclipse. And he analyzes it from its Puranic version to its more popular versions, and then to a social history version which shows no reference to gods or godhood at all. in order to talk about the ways in which lower castes actually think about and theorize their downfall. Now, those of us who are historians are very familiar with this, especially when the British began their process of census enumeration. There were large numbers of caste groups who put out a large number of theories about their origins in order to secure for themselves within this colonial archive of the census a higher standing than they actually enjoyed in everyday life. So you see a proliferation of, for example, origin myths, say around the 1870s, 1880s. I can speak, for instance, about one set at least, which is the Devanga, the weavers' stories, which are fascinating about their origins. So there are many kinds of such. So I'm giving you also a sense of how an archive, and in this case a state archive, namely the census, is actually engendering certain other kinds of archives. It's actually engendering, origin myths of the kind that are produced by people who want to be placed on a higher scale within the census than they would otherwise be, placed. So I want to not take too much more time, because I thought we could have a few minutes of questions. I'm going to spend the last 4 or 5 minutes left to me to discuss, especially in our times, because we are now, as you know, dominated by, as I say to many people, including my own students, now today everybody is a historian, everybody is writing history, and if they're not talking about history, they're actually producing it, they're contesting it, they are doing a lot of things that have become actually difficult for professional historians to counter, to be able to answer, and to be able to provide some way of helping young people especially who say, how do we find out what is the truth, what is the historical truth? And very often when you go to colleges and schools and so on and so forth, you get asked this question, but what was really the position of women in ancient India? What was really the story of this or that contentious past, So this question, how do we answer this? And I have for some time now been making the argument that all that we can teach our youngsters is the historical method. So let me just lay out for you this proposition that an archive is not an inert thing. It is something which actually comes to life as a consequence of the kinds of questions that we ask and the kinds of challenges that we put before the archive. It's not something that is inert and is going to answer questions. As I said, nothing begins in the archive. It's something like an interrupted story. So what are the kinds of ways we can think about a more reliable way of thinking historically? Let me just lay out a few things which I feel will be helpful, particularly because I see in this audience some young people. First, what is the source? What is said, by whom and why, and when and where was it written? These are questions that are very important to ask. Second, the context. When and where was the document created? And what was different then? Since, as we know, circumstances change and change quite dramatically, how does it affect how we read the document? And here I'm going to give you an example, taking it again from my own experience. I wrote a chapter for the 8th standard NCERT books, which were produced in 2006, entitled The History of Clothing. And in that history, I had 5 paragraphs on what is known and well known to those of us who are South Indian historians as the breast cloth disturbances, which were a set of disturbances which happened in the region of Kerala related to the people who decided to adopt clothing for their upper bodies in defiance of caste norms on the impetus that was provided by the missionaries. That 5-paragraph entry caused havoc 6 years later. So only in 2012 it was discovered by people in Tamil Nadu, and particularly by people who were from the Nadar community. The objection was to the use, there were many objections, but I'll just state this principal objection. One of the objections was to the use of the term shanar. They said that that's a demeaning caste term, and it is a term which is not used to describe our community anymore, and therefore it is demeaning to use it in any account of this rest club disturbances. Now what does the historian do? Because all the records that one reads refer to this community as Shanar. It's only in 1920 that the Nadars actually propositioned the Madras presidency and got the name change to happen officially, so that the community began to be referred to as Nadar. Now what does a historian do when the document is using one set of terms which are appropriate to that historical moment, but is in some ways unacceptable in our contemporary moment? How do you signal these kinds of shifts and changes? This is a very important task that lies before us, especially in a country like India, where there are so many contentious historical questions. So context is extremely important. C, this question of corroboration. What do other sources say? Do they actually support what this particular source is saying? Do they agree? Do they disagree? And if so, how do we put these things together? And finally, and importantly, this question of reading along or reading against the grain. When we read an archival source, do we read it as it was intended to be read? For example, I gave you the example of having worked on labor history. I'm currently working on peasant rebellion. Our sources are very often police sources, or at least sources of people who are inquiring into these rebellions. In other words, people who are establishing order. Do we read like a magistrate, or do we read like a historian? And if so, what is the difference? What claims are made by the author of this document? And how persuasive are these claims? How are we going to, and there is a wonderful article again by Ranajit Guha which tells us how perhaps the most important source for us to understand many of these peoples without history, the ones who do not leave, as it were, an archival trace, is of course the colonial record. But we have to carefully read the colonial record against the intention for which it was written. So while they were writing it in order to suppress the rebellion, in order to squash the rebellion, in order to identify the troublemakers and to punish them, we as historians have to read with greater empathy who these figures were, what the language of their reporting to the inquirers was, and what it reveals, what the language of the document itself reveals. I have found, for example, in police sources, various kinds of references in my work on KGF to anonymous notes which were signed by people called, those of you who know Tamil will perhaps recognize this, Dandasur Dadiraman. Now Dadiraman is like a figure who's a lazy layabout, eats a lot and so on and so forth. Quite the opposite of someone who is urged to work, be productive, be punctilious about discipline and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of humor as well which comes through. But remember that this is a police source, and the police are actually able to find these anonymous notes during the period of this 1930 strike, which are actually revealing to the historian of the kinds of perhaps even humorous ways in which people participating in almost, it was the 1930 strike was almost a life and death kind of strike that happened in KGF over the question of thumb impression. And it might interest you to know that historians, when we scan this, I'm just saying this as something to share with you the pleasure of going through newspaper archives, for example. So when I was looking for the evidence of this 1930 strike and its start, which was on April 7th, 1930, it was the same day that Gandhi broke the salt law. So something nationally important and historic was happening there at Dundee, and here in KGF there was this massive strike. Probably these KGF workers had not even heard of Gandhi at this moment, and definitely did not participate in the national movement at this moment. Their lives were actually endangered by the fact that the company was actually collecting their thumb impressions, and it was likely to lead to indebtedness of a particular kind. I won't go into the details of that. All I'm saying is that that moment actually lights up like a flash and gives you a set of records about people who have, as I said, not been able to leave their material trace themselves, and from whose record we have to be able to read, extrapolate as it were, some kind of idea of the kinds of lives that they may have led. So I will conclude this brief talk. I think I exceeded the time that was allotted to me, simply by saying that I think we are under some obligation to think not only about the collection of archives of this kind, and this is a magnificent job what has been done here. I cannot address what is in this connection directly because I have not worked on any of these materials, but I do want to emphasize that the responsibility of those of us who look at these materials, records and so on, is to keep in mind the kinds of questions that will allow us to, at least those last 4 points on which I concluded, allow us to interrogate, to be able to construct some kind of vision of a past that may not be the past that corresponds to what people who kept these records might have intended. Thank you. Is there a Q&A or are we?
There is a Q&A. Mic's not working. Sorry. Thanks so much, Janaki. Thanks so much for your time and for being such a strong supporter of the archives over the years. And thank you all for being here today. I did want to sort of acknowledge, as I was looking both on the Zoom and in the audience, something that Janaki had mentioned early on. I sort of see this. It doesn't happen often, but this flow should be acknowledged, which is a certain flow of thought, which is there are creators of archival material, the scientists in this room. There are custodians of archival material, some of you in this room, some of you on the Zoom call. There are archivists, of course, in this room, on the Zoom call. There are historians who navigate the archives, as Janaki has. There are users of the archive, and there are audiences. So I just feel like this flow of thought is a rare thing to come together. And of course, there are also funders. I see Arthur from Arcadia, and I see NCBS here, of course. So there's this flow, and people who enable the process. We're all here together. So thanks all so much for being here today. The other thing I just wanted to flag before we go is this has been an old sort of hope for mine, which is that on a weekend people should visit an archive. So thanks for doing that. Questions for Janaki and questions to the archival team.
The final example that you gave, I was just wondering, because the archival material you have by an individual, right? It's not necessarily representation of what was happening at that time in the society. I mean, it could be a representation, or sometimes it could be simply two individuals talking to each other in their expression, not necessarily represent the whole society. Let's say particular word, how it is used, or particular opinion about some aspect of the society. So how do we derive what the society, what was the larger picture of the society of that time? I mean, like just 200 years or 250 years earlier, by looking at just few letters of one or two individuals' correspondence.
Actually, any historical work looks at much more than just a few letters and correspondence and so on. As I said, we look for corroboration from other sources. I don't know if you're referring particularly to the things that are in the NCBS collection. But for instance, you look at private papers, definitely. But you might look at them after you've looked, for example, at newspaper collections, after you've looked perhaps at annual reports of the Department of Industries and Commerce. So for instance, if I wanted to use Coleman's work and I want to think about Mysore and agriculture, I would read all the agriculture reports, I would read the gazettes, I would read reports on what happened in agriculture which have been produced by the Mysore state, in addition to what one reads that Coleman has written. Okay, so that would be a supplement to a very rich set of materials. One doesn't only rely, for example, on his exchanges with whoever, it might only be his family. That is one. But the other is we now have actually also quite a well established body of secondary sources which talk about the state and its, so I'm again taking the example of Coleman, for example, which allows us to construct a picture of Coleman that is not entirely reliant only on his exchanges alone. There is also this. I mean, I presume also you're asking this question because of the example I gave of the Shana Nadar controversy. I think there is now a necessity for us to be extremely sensitive to the kinds of nomenclatural changes that have happened. The term Dalit, for instance, is of very recent origin. It's not longer than, say, the 1970s. Previous to that, the term that was used was depressed classes. Then it became Adi Dravida or Adi Karnataka in the 1920s, and then there were specific groups who used certain names. Gandhi, as you know, famously called them the Harijans. That is a term which is simply no longer used. But if you cite a Gandhian source, you are compelled to use that term because you are citing him, So I think citational sensitivities are something that need to be learned also. I think what we do, in fact, this is a question many of our students ask, what do we say and do when you come across a term like this? You have to footnote it and say, this term is no longer used, it's derogatory, and this is the term that people have given themselves, which is preferred, and so on and so forth. So glossing that entry is a necessary act. It's part of our task. It's part of our responsibility, I would say.
Good evening, ma'am. Actually, I am a student of history from Paris University.
Okay.
So it's fascinating to listen to you on this seat. So I have mainly two questions. One, I am a student researcher with some limited devices like this mobile phone. So what are the ways, suppose I am collecting an interview regarding something as my data collection tool, and what can be the ways to preserve it in digital form in a free manner, and to also how can I distribute it among the public in a free journal. And the second question is, if I am taking a photograph or interview which can be used by the further researchers, so what can be done for some kind of copyright or patent or like that? That's my question.
Copyright by whom? I think now
By the researcher.
the onus, no, well, actually, let me tell you that the onus now is on the researcher to actually follow a certain code of ethics that allows you to inform your subject that you are interviewing them for a particular purpose.
Yeah.
They have to sign a consent form before you can actually interview them.
Yeah.
And that cannot be your creation. That is their word. So in some ways that cannot be I don't know what the legal standing on this is. Venkat may be able to throw more light on it. But I am of the understanding that this is not something that can be the exclusive possession of the researcher, him or herself. It is something that equally belongs to the person who is interviewed. If they relinquish that right, it is a different matter. But if they don't, then I think there is something to be, there are some protocols to be observed. As far as making digital material available and so on, I think you people are much better at this. I belong to that generation which went physically through records, and I gave you this example only to tell you how important it is to go physically through certain records like newspapers. Then you see certain kinds of coincidences which perhaps you will not see when you do a digital search with a keyword. Because the keyword will only pull up that particular item, am I correct? Does it pull up the page? Not necessarily, no, in a newspaper search. Sometimes it may not. But in any case, all I'm trying to tell you is that I belong, I'm going to sound very, very old-fashioned here, but I really believe that if you have to be a historian, you must trawl through masses of materials in order to get to that small amount of material that you will finally be able to deploy in some piece of writing. I think Latamani also said, you know, that toil, that daily toil of visiting the archives, turning the pages, inhaling that dust, and so on. All these are experiences which you must have in order to get the badge or the honor of being a historian. Now it has become very easy for everybody to look for digital materials, and it's very wonderful that you've managed to scan so many materials and make things available at the touch of a click. But I do wish you will share some of the joys of going to an archive and turning pages and being able to see things. Allow yourself to be distracted, you know, to see other things that were happening at the same time that you are actually investigating.
Thank you so much, Janaki, for the wonderful historical perspective that you provided us. I have two quick questions. One with regards to the power dynamics that you mentioned, that maybe oral histories for people who are maybe on the suffering side. How do you determine the authenticity of the archival material that you get when there is power dynamics involved? That's one question. And the second one is like when you are describing historical sensitivity, or especially covering a situation where abuse or atrocity was involved, and you are referring to a terminology that was used in that context. Would it be advisable to use those terminology and also put a current day reference so as not to invoke or handle?
Thank you for the question about authenticity, because I think there's a lot of concern about the question of authenticity. And in some ways it's a difficult question to answer because so much has been claimed by so many different kinds of people, all of whom say that their sources are authentic. I've tried to lay out towards the end of my talk some ways in which you can ask questions. Who wrote this, or who said this, under what circumstances, what are the kinds of compulsions that were put on the person. For example, I gave you the example of people answering. For instance, I have written about an event that happened in the small village of Mysore in 1942 at the height of the Quit India movement, when villagers declared their village. There was a declared village in Karnataka which said that it was free of British rule, and they went ahead and killed, murdered, though not intentionally, a sub-inspector of police and an amaldar. So in the inquiry that follows, you have people speaking about, obviously they're giving alibis for where they were during this event and so on and so forth. Is it authentic? As I said to you, they are speaking in response to questions that are put to them. And you are aware of this as a historian. You're conscious of the fact that they are only answering questions. They're not necessarily narrating their life story because they are voluntarily narrating their life story, which would be quite different from, say, an oral history, where you're encouraging the person to narrate their life history, right? So there are two different kinds of authenticity. I think both are authentic, but you know that one record has been produced in a set of circumstances of which you have to be self-conscious. And you have to be able to signal that when you write, as much as you would have to signal it when you cite an oral history. And as far as, I think I have answered the second question while I was speaking itself, that we now have to show a great deal of sensitivity to changes in terminology that have happened over historical time. So, words which were derogatory, which might have been used customarily by people of particular castes or particular class locations, particular genders, people who compare women to donkeys, for example. But when you are citing that proverb, you know that you are citing a particular social setting, and that you are doing the commentary on that social setting with responsibility. So I think I cannot exaggerate enough, or rather emphasize enough, the necessity for ethics in historical work.
Good afternoon.
Yes.
Hello, Janaki.
Yes.
So my question is regarding, so we come across different versions of history. For example, in terms of emergency, what few ethnographers have visited and recorded that they saw emergency as a productive space for the middle classes or the subaltern. This is history which also portrays them as being really famished and victimized by the state. So how do you locate the proper history?
I didn't understand your question. Are you referring to the emergency of 75 to 77?
Yeah.
And you're referring to which group of people?
So like mostly the subalterns and the people who are in the fringes of the society.
I still don't get it. What's the historical conjuncture of the emergency doing to these people? I mean,
like them being oppressed and having no freedom of not only expression but productiveness versus certain ethno-lappers claiming emergency as a productive space for those classes.
I actually would like you to name them because I really am not sure what you are referring to here. I'm not aware of those who might be talking about the emergency as. I mean, there have been scholars, for example, I don't know if that's the person you're referring to, Mary John, who said that, for instance, the emergency was seen as a negative period, but actually, in some ways, it also produced an interest, since it coincided with Women's Year and so on, in the status of Women Report. Is that what you're referring to? That's, yeah, so, you know, that's totally different kind of argument. It's basically saying, it's not excusing the emergency, nor is it in any way exonerating Indira Gandhi for the kinds of authoritarian powers that she enjoyed, but rather to say that in that space, certain things were happening that, yes, I mean, of course, even somebody like Arvind Rajgopal talks about the middle class as perhaps seeing certain kinds of advantages in this period. Mary is certainly making the argument that in the space of that time, there's a coincidence that there is an interest in the women's question, and it leads to this marvelous report which becomes the foundation of women's studies in India. So it's actually tracking certain kinds of things that are parallel, rather than necessarily saying that they are the result of authoritarianism, you know. I think that's the kind of distinction perhaps we have to maintain.
Yeah. Good evening, ma'am. I'm Ayush from 11th. I'm in 11th Graduate College. Actually, ma'am, I had a question. I was reading one of your lectures, and you told about how history textbook nowadays have become a battlefield for many different groups to include their version of history. But, ma'am, what do you think? Like, do you really think that's a bad thing? Like, what's your view on this? Suppose a person who is suppose Northeast, which was like a very, very, very neglected area, and history textbooks were not talking about it much. They are now demanding more representation in the history book, and as we know, our centralized education system has one history textbook, NCRT. Yeah, we have state boards, but yeah, it's one CBSE textbook. So, what do you think? What is that? Is it bad? Is it good? If it's good, how can we, include these words of history? What do you think? Like,
you know, I'm not going to use words like bad and good. I think that the pressure to be, and let me answer your question in different ways, because it's a very important question, and it's coming from somebody who obviously reads NCRT books. Am I correct?
No, currently I'm in state board.
You're in the state board.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter. First of all, let me tell you, the NCRT books actually circulate in a very small section of schools. Yeah. Okay, it's not, CBSE schools are not the majority. State boards are the majority, and then there is ICSE and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, they are very influential. Okay, and you're absolutely correct. There are what the 2006 books tried to do, and I will defend those books for that reason, is precisely what you are saying should have happened. It precisely tried to include questions, regions, peoples who had not been represented in conventional history books. So it moved away from, the only thing you can be in India as a nationalist, to being, what is the life of pastoralism, for example. There is a chapter on pastoralism, am I correct? You know this. There was a history of sport. There was a history of print culture, for example, because the world of print is becoming so important from the 19th century onwards. Don't we need to know about it? There was definitely work on the Northeast, and so on. It's precisely that lack of this nationalist frame that people have objected to. And the objections have come precisely because it does not have that thematic unity that the earlier textbook had, which was a glorious story of Indian freedom struggle ending in independence. This was the narrative which one tried to change in the new textbooks. For the first time, the textbooks actually reflected the work of many historians. As many as 60 people worked on those textbooks, not one. So they were bringing in expertise of different kinds, okay? I contributed only 3 chapters. There were others who contributed other chapters. People from the Northeast wrote their history. People who had studied pastoralists wrote that history. People who had talked about, questions of gender wrote that history, etc. So I'm saying to you that that was a welcome change. But there were 2 kinds of discomfort. One, teachers found it difficult to teach because teachers find it easier to teach one single narrative. Secondly, you have this sword, this Damoclean sword of the exam. You have to somehow pass the exam. And when you have a textbook which tells you, look here, there are 2 ways of thinking about fascism, from the point of view of the perpetrators and from the point of view of those who were the victims, then the student gets confused, the teacher is confused, and nobody knows what to do with the historical method. They say, what is the possible answer? We do not have a satisfactory way of conducting an exam on the mass scale that we have in India without engaging with these kinds of questions. So actually, in some ways, the textbook alone cannot be changed. That's the realization that came to us. Textbook alone, the whole system has to change. Teacher training has to change. Exam systems have to change. So teachers would simply tell their students, leave out those boxes. That which tells you, look at this and see, compare that source and this source. Leave it out. It's too complicated. You can't deal with it. Let's get the answers. This happened in 1857. This happened after 1857, etc. So people are more comfortable with answering those kinds of positivist answer questions. Our history has moved away a great deal from that kind of.
No, but
So what you're saying is right, and what you're saying is what we attempted in the 2006 books. That it is now reverting again to my hero, your hero. That's the kind of history from which we had moved away. It's not only about heroes. It's not only about good kings and bad queens. Can we get beyond that? Can we have a history of science? What is the question of science? What are the questions of science that have animated Indian society? Can we have that kind of history, and which tells us a bit more?
But ma'am, I had one question about it. As you told that 2006 the book development committee attempted to include all the versions. But ma'am, you have understood version in that way that you have to include all the events that happen in the country. But suppose I will give you an example. I think in 10th CBS I read there was a chapter about Indian independence, and Alluri Sitaram Raju was cited, and it was told that it was like, if you read it, you can infer that it was due to the Gandhiji's influence. Now
now you have RRR, which is telling a different story, right?
Not RRR, but I'm saying that people. I read some articles that said, no, Gandhiji, you are making him a god, or making him a big figure, but I don't think that much influence was there of Gandhiji on.
It's interesting you're saying this, because that's exactly what historians are saying. Historians are saying that Gandhi's message, I gave you the example of Mysore just now, I'm going to repeat it. Gandhi's message was taken away by the Indian people in different ways. In 1942, he said, do or die, karo ya maro. But it was interpreted as karo ya maro. And people went and actually, yes, it happened. My Mysore villagers killed 2 people. They thought they were acting in the name of Gandhi. Okay, so Gandhi's message was understood in multiple ways. Historians have now documented these multiple ways. It's not only in one way. He was not just, in fact, he was, by 1942, he had lost control of the movement. That's what we understand also, okay? So even in Chauri Chaura, he lost control. That's why he called off non-cooperation, right? So my point is that this is something that historians have actually already discussed. Now, it is too complicated a story to tell in the space of a school textbook. I agree with you. I think that now school textbooks should only focus on method. The last 4 points which I laid out. I think that we can only teach method. And we have to encourage students to be able to, because we are living in an information age. Information is not our job to give you information. You can find it at the tip of your fingers. You should be able to understand, appreciate, and reflect on what you are reading. And I hope that some of these things I've laid out will help you to think critically about what you are reading on WhatsApp.
Thanks so much, Janaki, and thanks for the questions. This is a perfect segue to say, for everything else, there's the archive. So, do visit the space again on behalf of all of us. Thanks again, Janaki, for it.
Thank you for your patience.
So one of the things that just to let you know what's coming up next, what we want to do in the last 5 years has been to try and set up an archive at scale that is transparent and public. So I just want to flag just a couple of quick things that we have set up a space that is digitally publicly accessible. But there are sort of guidelines, and we are very happy to work with donors and users. If there are things that we feel we should take down, if there are things that you contest, there are policies on our website that outline why we made something accessible and how you can go about taking it down, or at least putting in a request to do that. So just wanted to sort of make sure that we sort of put that out, because we want to do right by both the donor and the user. So thanks so much to all the donors who are in the audience and the users who will hopefully come to the archives. We're going to walk out now towards the amphitheater next to the archives. Those of you who know it, please leave the ones who don't. And there'll be refreshments there, and there'll be a curatorial talk by the exhibition team for the next exhibition, breakfast table. And we will have walkthroughs of the archive and the spaces around it. Thanks so much for being here.